Chapter 8. Lines of Reform. Having now applied the principle with which we started to the several cases where it appears to be most flagrantly overlooked, we are in a better position to estimate the difficulties and the possibilities of its future acceptance. Our investigation of animals' rights has necessarily been in large measure an enumeration of animals' wrongs, a story of cruelty and injustice which might have been unfolded in far greater and more impressive detail had there been any reason for here repeating what has been elsewhere established by other writers beyond doubt or dispute. But my main purpose was to deal with the general theory rather than with particular instances, and enough has already been said to show that while man has such a cause to be grateful to the lower animals for their immemorable services rendered by them, he can hardly pride himself on the record of the counter benefits which they have received at his hands. If we consider, says Primate, the excruciating injuries offered on our part to the brutes, and the patience of their part, how frequent our provocation, and how seldom their resentment, and in some cases our weakness, and their strength, and our slowness, and their swiftness, one would be almost tempted to suppose that the brutes had combined in one general scheme of benevolence to teach mankind lessons of mercy and meekness by their own forbearance and long suffering. It is unwise, no doubt, to dwell too exclusively on the wrongs of which animals are the victims. It's still more unwise to ignore them, as are today ignored by the large majority of mankind. It is full time that this question were examined in the light of some rational and guiding principle, and that we cease to drift helplessly between the extremes of total indifference on the one hand and spasmodic partially applied compassion on the other. We have had enough, and too much, of trifling with this or that isolated aspect of this subject, and of playing off the exposure of someone else's insensibility by way of a balance for our own, as if a tu quoque was a sufficient justification of a man's moral delinquencies. The terrible sufferings that are quite needlessly inflicted on the lower animals under the plea of domestic usage, food demands, sport, fashion and science, are patent to all who have the seeing eye and the feeling of heart to apprehend them. Those sufferings will not be lessened, nor will man's responsibility be diminished by any such irrelevant assertions as that of vivisection is less cruel than sport, or sport less cruel than butchering, nor yet by the contrary contention that vivisection, or sport, or flesh-eating, as the case may be, is the one prime origin of all human inhumanity. We want a comprehensive principle which will cover all of these varying instances and determine the true lines of reform. Such a principle, as I have throughout insisted, can only be found in the recognition of the right of animals, as of men, to be exempt from any unnecessary suffering or serfdom, the right to live a natural life of restricted freedom, subject to the real, not supposed or pretended requirements of the general community. It may be said, and with truth, that the perilous vagueness of the word necessary must leave a convenient loophole of escape to anyone who wishes to justify his own treatment of animals. However unjustifiable that treatment may appear, the vivisector will assert that his practice is necessary in the interests of science, the flesh-eater that he cannot maintain his health without animal food, and so on throughout the whole category of systematic oppression. The difficulty is an inevitable one. No form of words can be devised for the expression of rights, human or animal, which is not liable to some sort of evasion, and all that can be done to fix the responsibility of deciding between what is necessary and unnecessary, between factitious personal wants and genuine social demands, on those in whom is vested the power of exacting the service or sacrifice required. The appeal being thus made, and the issue thus stated, it may be confidently trusted that the personal conscience of the individuals and the public conscience of their nation, acting and reacting in turn on each other, will slowly and surely work out the only possible solution of this difficult and many-sided problem. For that the difficulties involved in this animal question are many and serious, no one imagined would dispute, and certainly no attempt has been made or will be made in this essay to minimise or deny them. It may suit the purpose of those who would retard all humanitarian progress to represent its advocates as mere dreamers or sentimentalists, men and women who befool themselves by shutting their eyes to the fierce struggle that is everywhere being waged in the world of nature, while they point with virtuous indignation to the iniquities perpetuated by man. But it is possible to be quite free from any such sentimental illusions and yet hold a very firm belief in the principle of animals' rights. We do not deny or attempt to explain away the existence of evil in nature, or the fact that the life of the lower races, as of mankind, is based to a large degree on rapine or violence, nor can we pretend to say whether this evil will ever be wholly amended. It is therefore confessedly impossible at the present time to formulate an entirely and logically consistent philosophy of rights, but that would be a poor argument against grappling with the subject at all. The hard, unmistakable facts of the situation, when viewed in their entirety, are not by any means calculated to inspire with confidence the opponents of humane reform. For if it be true that internecine competition is a great factor in the economy of nature, it is no less true, as has already been pointed out, that cooperation is also a great factor herein. Furthermore, though, there are many difficulties besetting the onward path of humanitarianism, an even greater difficulty has to be faced by those who refuse to proceed along that path, viz. The fact as strong a fact as any as that can be produced on the other side, that the instinct of compassion and justice to the lower animals has already been so largely developed in the human conscience as to obtain legislative recognition. If the theory of animals' rights is a mere idealistic fantasy, it follows that we have long ago admitted ourselves to a trap which can lead us no whither. It is proposed that we should retrace our steps with a view to regaining the antique position of savage and consistent callousness, or are we to remain perpetually in our present meaningless attitude, admitting the moral value of a partially awakened sensibility, yet opposing an eternal non-possumus to any further improvement? Neither of these alternatives is for a moment conceivable. It is perfectly certain that there will still be a forward movement, and along the same lines as the past. Nor need we be at all disconcerted by the derisive inquiries of our antagonists as to the final outcome of such theories. There is some reason to hope, said the author of the ironical Vindication of Rights of Brutes, that this essay will soon be followed by treatises on the rights of vegetables and minerals, and that thus the doctrine of perfect equality will become universal. To which suggestion we need only answer, perhaps it is for each age to initiate its own ethical reforms according to the light and sensibility of its own instincts. Further and more abstruse questions at present insoluble may safely be left to the more mature judgment of posterity. The human conscience furnishes the safest and simplest indicator in these matters. We know that certain acts of injustice affect us as they did not affect our forefathers. It is our duty to set these right. It is not our duty to agitate problems which at the present day excite no unmistakable moral feeling. The humane instinct will assuredly continue to develop, and it should be observed that to advocate the rights of animals is far more than to plead for compassion or justice towards the victims of ill usage. It is not only, and not primarily, for the sake of the victims that we plead, but for the sake of mankind itself, our true civilization, our race progress, our humanity in the best sense of the term, are concerned in this development. It is ourselves, our own vital instincts, that we wrong when we trample the rights of fellow beings, human or animal, over whom we chance to hold jurisdiction. It has been admirably said that terrible as it is that a lot of these subjects of cruelty and injustice, that of the perpetrators is even worse, by reason of the debasement and degradation of character implied and incurred. For the principles of humanity cannot be renounced with impunity, but their reinscenation, if persisted in, involves inevitably the forfeiture of humanity itself, and to cease through such forfeiture to be man is to become demon. The most important point is consistently overlooked by the opponents of the humanitarian reform. They labour unsuccessfully enough to minimise the complaints of animals' wrongs on the plea that these wrongs, though great, are not as great as they are represented to be, and that in any case it is not possible or not urgently desirable for man to alleviate them, as if human interests are also not intimately bound up in every such compassionate endeavour. The case against injustice to animals stands, in this respect, on exactly the same grounds as the case in justice to man, and may be illustrated by some suggestive words of De Quincey's on the typical subject of corporal punishment. The practice, he remarks, is usually argued with the single reference to the case of him who suffers it, and so argued, God knows that it is worthy of all abhorrence, but the weightiest arguments against it is the foul indignity which is offered to our common nature, lodged in the person of him on whom it is inflicted. And this brings us back to the moral of the whole matter. The idea of humanity is no longer confined to man. It is beginning to extend itself to the lower animals, as in the past it has been gradually extended to savages and slaves. Behold the animals, there is not one, but the human soul lurks within it, fulfilling its destiny as surely as in within you. So writes the author of Towards Democracy, and what has long been felt by the poet is now being scientifically corroborated by the anthropologist and philosopher. The standpoint of modern thought, says Buchner, no longer recognises in animals a difference of kind, but only a difference of degree, and sees the principle of intelligence developing through an endless and unbroken series. It is noteworthy that on this point evolutionary science finds itself in agreement with Oriental tradition. The doctrine of metempsychosis, says Strauss, knits men and beasts together here in the East and unties the whole of nature in one sacred and mysterious bond. The breach between the two was opened in the first place by Judaism and its hatred of the gods of nature, next by the dualism of Christianity. It is remarkable that at present a deeper sympathy with the animal world should have arisen among the more civilized nations, which manifests itself here and there in societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals. It is thus apparent that what on the one hand is the product of modern science, the giving up of the spiritualistic isolation of man from nature, reveals itself simultaneously through the channel of popular sentiment. It is not human life only that is lovable and sacred, but all innocent and beautiful life. The great republic of the future will not confine its benevolence to man. The isolation of man from nature by our persistent culture of the ratiocinative faculty and our persistent neglect of the instinctive has hitherto been the penalty we may have had to pay for our incomplete and partial civilization. There are many signs that the tendency will now be towards that return to nature of which Rousseau was the prophet, but let it not for a moment be supposed that an acceptance of the gospel of nature implies an abandonment or depreciation of intellect. On the contrary, it is the assertion that reason itself can never be at its best, can never be truly rational, except when it is in perfect harmony with the deep-seated emotional instincts and sympathies which underlie all thought. The true scientist and humanist is he who will reconcile brain to heart and show us how, without any sacrifice of what we have gained in knowledge, we may resume what we have temporarily lost during the process of acquiring that knowledge. The sureness of intuitive faculty, which is originally implanted in man and animals alike. Only by this return to common the feeling will it be possible for man to place himself in a right relationship towards the lower animals, and break down the fatal barrier of antipathy that he has himself erected. If we contrast the mental and moral attitude of the generality of mankind towards the lower races with that of such men as St. Francis or Thoreau, we see that far-reaching possibilities still lie before us in the line of development, and what an immense extension is even now waiting to be given our most advanced ideas of social unity and brotherhood. I have already remarked on the frequent and not altogether unjustifiable complaint against lovers of animals, that they are often indifferent to the struggle for human rights, while they concern themselves so eagerly over the interests of the lower races. Equally true is the converse statement that many earnest reformers and philanthropists, men who have genuine passion for human liberty and progress, are coldly sceptical or even bitterly hostile on the subject of rights of animals. This organic limitation of sympathies must be recognised and regretted, but it is worse than useless for the one class of reformers to indulge in blame or recrimination against the other. It is certain they are both working towards the same ultimate end, and if they cannot actually cooperate, they may at least refrain from unnecessarily thwarting and opposing one another. The principles of justice, if they are to make a solid and permanent headway, must be applied with thoroughness and consistency. If there are rights of animals, it must be at A. fortiori, B. rights of men, and as I have shown, it is impossible to maintain that an admission of human rights does not also involve an admission of animals' rights also. Now, it may not always fall to the lot of the same persons to advocate both kinds of rights, but these rights are nevertheless being simultaneously and concurrently advocated, and those who are in a position to take a clear and wide survey of the whole humanitarian movement are aware that its final success is dependent on the broad onward tendency. Man will not be truly man, says Michelet, until he shall labour seriously for which the earth expects from him, the pacification and harmoniousness union of all living nature. The advent of democracy, imperfect though any democracy must be, which does not embrace all living things within its scope, will be of enormous assistance to the cause of animals' rights. For the present unequal and unequitable social system, there is no possibility of those claims receiving their due share of attention. In the rush and hurry of competitive society, where commercial profit is avowed to be the main object of work, and where the well-being of men and women is ruthlessly sacrificed to that object, what likelihood is there that the lower animals will not be used with sole regard to the same predominant purpose? Humane individuals may here or there protest, and the growing conscience of the public may express itself in legislation against the worst forms of palpable ill usage, but the bulk of the people simply cannot and will not afford to treat animals as they ought to be treated. Do the wealthy classes show any such consideration? Let amateur butchery and murderous millinery be the answer. Can it be wondered then that the lower classes, whose own rights are existent far more in theory than in fact, should exhibit a feeling of sordid indifference to the rights of still lower animals? It has been said that if in a mob of Londoners, Parisians, New Yorkers, Berliners, Melbourners, a dove fluttered down to seek a refuge, 100 dirty hands would be stretched out to seize it and wring its neck, and if anyone tried to save and cherish it, he would be rudely bonneted and mocked and hustled amidst the brutal cafouls of roughs, lower, more hideous in aspect and in nature than in any animal which lives. This may be so, yet it must be remembered that it is not the people, but the lords, who have hitherto prevented the suppression, in England at any rate, of the infamous pastime of pigeon shooting. It is to the democracy and the democratic sense of kinship and brotherhood, extending first to mankind and then to the lower races, that we must look for future progress. The emancipation of men will bring with it another and still wider emancipation of animals. In conclusion, we are brought face to face with this practical problem. By what immediate means can we best provide for the attainment of the end we have in view? What are the surest remedies for the present wrongs, and the surest pledges for the future rights of the victims of human supremacy? The answer, I think, must be that there are two preeminently important methods which are sometimes regarded as contradictory in principle, but which, as I hope to show, are not only quite compatible, but even mutually serviceable and to some degree interdependent. We have no choice but to work by one or other of these methods, and, if we are wise, we shall endeavour to work by both simultaneously, using the first as our chief instrument of reform, the second as an auxiliary and supplementary instrument. The two methods to which I allude are the educational and the legislative. 1. Education in the largest sense of the term has always been, and must always remain, the antecedent and indispensable condition of humanitarian progress. Very excellent are the words of John Bright on the subject. Let us forget that he was an angler. Humanity to animals is a great point. If I were a teacher in a school, I would make it very important part of my business to impress every boy and girl with the duty of his or her being kind to all animals. It is impossible to say how much suffering there is in the world from the barbarity of unkindness which people show to what we call the inferior creatures. It may be doubted, however, whether the young will ever be specially impressed with the lesson of humanity, as long as the general tone of their elders and instructors is one of cynical indifference, if not of absolute hostility, to the recognition of animals' rights. It is a society as a whole, and not one class in particular, that needs enlightenment and remonstrance. In fact, the very conception and scope of what is known as a liberal education must be revolutionised and extended. For if we find fault with the narrow and unscientific spirit of what is known as science, we must in fairness admit that our academic humanities, the literae humaniores of colleges and schools, together with much of our modern culture and refinement, are scarcely less deficient in that quickening of spirit of sympathetic brotherhood, without which all the accomplishments that the mind of man can devise are as the borrowed cloak of an imperfectly realised civilization, assumed by some barbarous tribe but half emerged from savagery. The divorce of humanism from humaneness is one of the subtlest dangers of which society is beset, for if we grant that love needs to be tempered and directed by wisdom, still more needful is it that wisdom should be informed and vitalised by love. It is therefore not only our children who need to be educated in the proper treatment of animals, but our scientists, our religionists, our moralists, and our men of letters, for in spite of the vast progress of humanitarian ideas during the present century, it must be confessed that the popular exponents of Western thought are still for the most part quite unable to appreciate the profound truth of those words of Rousseau, which should form a basis of an enlightened system of instruction. I'm going to give that a swerve because you're better off reading it than me even attempting to pronounce it. But how is the vast educational change to be inaugurated, let alone accomplished? Like all far-reaching reforms, which are prompted by a few believers in the face of the public indifferentism, it can only be carried through by the energy and resolution of its supporters. The efforts which the various humane societies are making in special directions, each concentrating its attack on a particular abuse, must be supplemented and strengthened by a crusade an intellectual, literary and social crusade against the central cause of oppression, viz. The disregard of the natural kinship between man and the animals, and the consequent denial of their rights. We must insist on having the whole question fully considered and candidly discussed, and must no longer permit its most important issues to be shirked because it does not suit the conveniences or the prejudice of comfortable folk to give attention to them. Above all, the sense of ridicule that at present attaches to the supposed sentimentalism of an advocacy of animal rights must be faced and swept away. The fear of this absurd charge deprives the cause of humanity of many workers who would otherwise lend their aid, and accounts in part for the unduly diffident and apologetic tone which is too often adopted by humanitarians. We must meet this ridicule and retort it without hesitation on those to whom it properly pertains. The laugh must be turned against the true cranks and croquet mongers, the noodles who can give no wiser reason for the infliction of suffering on animals than it is better for the animals themselves, the flesh-eaters who labour under the pious belief that animals were sent for us as food, the silly women who imagine that the corpse of a bird is becoming article of headgear, the half-witted sportsmen who vow that the vigour of an English race is dependent on the practice of fox hunting, and the half-enlightened scientists who are aware that vivisection has moral and spiritual, no less physical consequences. That many of our arguments are mere superficial swordplay and do not touch the profound emotional sympathies on which the cause of humanity rests is a fact which does not lessen their controversial significance. For this is the case where those who take the sword shall perish by the sword, and the clever men of the world who twit constant humanitarians with sickly sentimentality may perhaps discover that they themselves, fixed as they are in an ambiguous and utterly untenable position, are the sickliest sentimentalists of all. 2. Legislation. Where the protection of harmless animals is concerned, is the fit supplement and sequel to education, and the objections used against it are for the most part unreasonable. It must inevitably fail in its purpose, say some, for how can the mere passing of a penal statute prevent the innumerable unwitnessed acts of cruelty and oppression which make up the great total of animal suffering? But the purpose of legislation is not merely thus preventative. Legislation is the record, the register of the moral sense of the community. It follows, not precedes, the development of that moral sense, but nevertheless, in its turn, rests on it, strengthens it, and secures it against the danger of retrocession. It is well that society should proclaim formally and decisively its abhorrence of certain practices, and I do not think that it can be doubted by those who have studied the history of the movement that the general treatment of domestic animals in England, bad as it still is, would be infinitely worse at this day but for the progressive punitative legislation that dates from the passing of Martin's Act in 1822. The further argument, so commonly advanced, that force is no remedy, and that it is better to trust to the good feeling of mankind than to impose a legal restriction, is an amiable criticism which might doubtless be applied with great effect to a large majority of our existing penal enactments, but it is not very applicable to the case under discussion. For, if force is ever allowable, surely it is so when it is applied for a strictly defensive purpose, such as to safeguard the weak and helpless from violence and aggression. The protection of animals by statute marks but another step onward in that course of humanitarian legislation, which among numerous triumphs has abolished slavery and passed the Factory Acts, always in the teeth of the same time-honoured but irrelevant objection that force is no remedy. Equally fallacious is the assertion that the administrators of the law cannot be trusted to adjudicate between master and beast. It was long ago stated by Lord Erskine that to distinguish the severest discipline for enforcing activity and commanding obedience in such dependence from brutal ferocity and cruelty never yet puzzled a judge or jury, never, at least in my long experience. Such arguments against the legal protection of animals were admirably refuted by John Stuart Mill. The reasons for legal intervention in favour of children, he said, apply not less strongly to the case of those unfortunate slaves and the victims of the most brutal part of mankind, the lower animals. It is by grossest misunderstanding of the principles of liberty that the infliction of an exemplary punishment on ruffianism practised towards these defenceless beings has been treated as a meddling by the government with things beyond its province, an interference with domestic life. The domestic life of domestic tyrants is one of the things which it's most imperative on the law to interfere with, and it is to be regretted that metaphysical scruples respecting the nature and source of the authority of a government should induce many warm supporters of laws against cruelty to the lower animals to seek for jurisdiction of such laws in the incidental consequences of the indulgent and the ferocious habits to the interest of human beings, rather than in the intrinsic merits of the thing itself. What it would be the duty of a human being possessed of the requisite physical strength to prevent by force if attempted in his presence, it cannot be less incumbent of society generally to repress. The existing laws of England are chiefly defective in the trifling, often most nominal, maximum to which the penalty, even in worse cases, is limited. Let us turn now to the practical politics of the question, and consider in what instances we may suitably appeal for further legislative recognition of the rights of animals. Admitting that their education must always precede law, and we can only make penal those offences which are already condemned by the better feeling of the nation, we are still bound to point out that in several particulars there is now an urgent need of bringing the lagging influence of the legislature into line with the rapidly advancing public opinion. It is possible that in some cases certain prevalent cruelties might be suppressed, without any change in the law, by magistrates and juries giving a wider interpretation to the rather vague wording of the existing statutes. If this cannot be done, the statutes themselves should be amended so as to meet the larger requirements of a more enlightened national conscience. There are not a few cruel practices common in England at the present day, which are very wit as strongly condemned by thinking people as were bull-baiting and cockfighting at the time of their prohibition in 1835. Foremost among these practices, because supported by the sanction of the state and carried on in the Queen's name, is the institution of the Royal Buckhounds. It does not seem too much to demand that all worrying of tame and captured animals, whether of the stag turned out from the cart, the rabbit from the sack, or the pigeon from the cage, should be interpreted as equivalent to baiting, and so brought within the scope of the Acts of 1835 and 1849. There is also a need for extending to others some sort of protection against the wholly unnecessary torture that are recklessly inflicted on them, and of abolishing and restricting the common use of the barbarous steel trap. The exposure lately made of the horrors of the Atlantic cattle ship scenes that reproduce almost exactly the worst atrocities of the slaver is likely to lead to some welcome improvement in the details of that lugubrious traffic. But this will not be sufficient in itself, for the cruelties committed in the slaughter, no less than the transit of livestock, call imperatively for some public cognizance and reprobation. The discontinuance in our crowded districts of all private slaughterhouses, and the substitution of public abattoirs under efficient municipal control, would do something to mitigate the worst features of the evil, and this reform should at once be pressed to the attention of local legislative bodies. Lastly, in the short list of urgent temporary measures stands the question of vivisection, and here there can be no relaxation of the demand for total and unqualified prohibition. But when all is said, it remains true that legislation, important though as it is, must ever be secondary to the awakening of human instincts. Even education itself can only appeal with success to those minds who are in some degree naturally predisposed to receive it. I have spoken of the desirability of an intellectual crusade against the main causes of the unjust treatment of animals, but I would not be understood to believe, as some humanitarians appear to do, that a hardened world might be miraculously converted by the preaching of a new St. Francis, if somehow the personality could be evolved out of our 19th century commercialism. In this infinitely complex modern society, great wrongs cannot be wholly righted by simple means, not even by consuming enthusiasm of the prophet, since any particular form of injustice is but part and parcel of a far more deep-lying evil, the selfish, aggressive tendencies that are so largely inherent in the human race. Only with the gradual process of an enlightened sense of equality shall we remedy these wrongs, and the object of our crusade should not be so much to convert opponents, who by the very disabilities and limitations of their faculties can never be really converted, as to set the confused problem in a clear light, and at least discriminate unmistakably between our enemies and our allies. In all social controversies, the issues are greatly obscured by the babble of names and phrases and cross-arguments that are bandied to and fro, so that many persons who by natural sympathy and inclination are the friends of the reform are found to be ranked among its foes, while not a few of its foes in similar unconsciousness have strayed into the opposite camp. To state the issues distinctly, and so attract and consolidate a genuine body of support, is, perhaps at the present time, the best service that humanitarians can render the movement they wish to promote. In conclusion, I would state emphatically that this essay is not an appeal ad misericordiam to those who themselves practice or who condone in others the deed against which a protest is here raised. It is not a plea for mercy, save the mark, to the brute beasts whose sole criminality consists in not belonging to the noble family of Homo sapiens. It is addressed rather to those who see and feel that, as been well said, the great advancement of the world throughout the ages is to be measured by the increase of humanity and the decrease of cruelty, that man, to be truly man, must cease to abdicate his common fellowship with all living nature, and that the coming realisation of human rights will inevitably bring after it the tardier but no less certain realisation of the rights of lower races.